Have this chance to talk to you about something that I've been practicing for many years and which I have liked very much, which is science diplomacy. But that name is a recent name, and we didn't call it that. We called it science cooperation or working with other people or so on. But anyway, we'll talk to you. Anyway, I was born in Macomb, Illinois in 1932. My father had just immigrated from Austria and took a job teaching at the normal school there. And really, he ended up working for a few years there, and then we moved to upstate New York, where he was also teaching at a normal school. And he stayed there for almost 50 years until he retired. My mother was the daughter, one of the daughters of a Swedish farm family that had emigrated from Sweden, but she was born in the U.S. Father, as I said, born in Austria, and then emigrating after the First World War to the U.S. He just missed going into the war. He was inducted and was in training, and really saw no battle action, fortunately. You know, there's been a recent dedication of the 100th anniversary of World War I, and it was one terrible war and slaughter. And it's very useful for people to take a look at that. If you want motivation to do science diplomacy around the world, go look at the history of World War I. Then there's, on top of that, just 20 years later, it's unbelievable, comes World War II. And all its horror, which is also pretty terrible. But anyway, I graduated from high school at 16. My father said, look, why don't you try to do it in 3 years? And it turns out to have been very easy to do in 3 years. He also said something else to me. He said, Norman, you can major in anything you want, which actually happened to be chemistry, organic chemistry. But he said, learn Russian, because it's going to be useful someday. And I've never had such excellent advice from my father, and I'll tell you some of that later. But I did. I went to I went to college at age 16. I was kind of the youngest kid on the block, and but managed to get into a fraternity when they saw me trying to get popcorn out of a machine without paying for it, and they said, "Oh, maybe he's all right after all." So anyway, I got into a fraternity and had those experiences. I didn't quite know what I wanted to study or to major in, but it turned out to be chemistry. Actually, my father didn't practice chemistry, but he taught science and math in the normal schools that I mentioned before. But anyway, I majored in chemistry, and that was my specialty, and then went on to graduate school. But I never forgot what my father said about learning Russian, because it's going to be useful someday. So I found it turns out there was a Russian class at Chicago, in Rochester, the University of Rochester, and it was at another campus. They had two campuses at that time, one for men and one for women. They're about 3 miles apart. But anyway, so twice a week I would go to this night school class in Russian, and I was by far the best student, without bragging. It was mostly ex-military people who had fought in the war and were interested in Russian. But let me tell you, Russian's pretty hard, and you got to be serious if you're going to do it. Well, the teacher was so afraid, because we got down to 5 students, and fewer than 5, they canceled the course. So she made sure she would give us a dry run on the test 1 week before we took it, and so everybody had a chance to pass, and people did pass. But anyway, I was without bragging, I was the best student, and I loved Russian, and I would hitchhike to New York and hang around the Russian newspaper and things like that. So I actually came out of school with some knowledge of Russian, and that turned out to be enormously useful for me later on. I went to Northwestern, I majored in chemistry, and I was in my third year, but I had, for some reason or other, I had applied, possibly with a recommendation of my thesis professor, and I got it. And as I applied for it, I applied to go to Germany. It was only the third year after the war that the Fulbright program operated in Germany. So there was quite a large group of people. There were, I don't know, 150 of us or something. Quite a large group, and they spread all over Germany. I was in Munich, and in Munich, and you could hardly have a nicer place to go to school or do chemistry. So I really spent the year, or much of the year, in the laboratory, in the chemistry laboratory, organic chemistry laboratory of the University of Munich. And the students said, you know, you're lucky because this is a new building from the war. Last year we were standing in an inch of water when it rained badly because the place was still pretty much destroyed. Remember, this was exactly 10 years after the end of the war. And you could still see the damage in Munich and some other cities like Dresden. But anyway, it was Germany took a lot of bombs at the end of the war, and they certainly deserved it from what they did to the rest of the countries of Europe. Now, for the first month, I lived with a German family, and the father in that family had been taken into the army, and actually he seemed to be a little quirky in some ways. Well, it turns out he had been in the Battle of Leningrad, and I just finished a book on the Battle of Leningrad, and it was one terrible thing with millions of people starving to death, millions of people dying in what the Germans did. So he was lucky he escaped with just a frostbite. But anyway, that was a bit of an introduction to the remains of the war, even 10 years after it was over. But it was very good to live with the German family because I acquainted myself with the Bavarian dialect, which was spoken frequently, and I learned some of that, and it was fun later to use. But anyway, they were very gracious and generous to me, and it certainly got my language better. Later on, I hired a phonetics student at the university, and I said, your job is to teach me perfect pronunciation of every letter combination in the German language. And he did, but after 2.5 months, he said, Norman, I can't teach you anymore, you've got it. So anyway, I was proud of my German. I'm sure it wasn't all that fantastic, but anyway, I certainly got by with it. The laboratory was quite famous. Munich was a famous place for scholarship. Professor Huskin, who guided the work, I still had some tests to do. We used to take a monthly test at Northwestern where I was doing my graduate work. And I was in the third year, and I said, maybe I should not accept this. And my research director said, no, Norman, this is the experience of your life. This is one of the greatest things you take. So you go. And we'll delay your work, and you can finish your thesis your research and your thesis when you come back. So anyway, that's what I did. I didn't make any great discoveries in the lab, but I met a lot of people. I learned my German actually got pretty good, and it was it was an amazing experience. You couldn't have a better city for it than Munich. Great history, great history of science there. Great the big beer hall is there in Munich, and their annual big affair is also there. It's a very interesting and active place. Unfortunately, it's also a place where Hitler really started as well, and that is a sour event in the history of the country. What they did, to do your final qualification at Northwestern, you took a monthly test, and they actually worked it out so they would send the test to Germany, and the professor there would supervise it, and I would take it, and that helped me move along that thing so that I didn't have to stay much longer when I got back and finished my research and so on. The finishing up at Northwestern, I got a PhD degree, and I guess I started thinking of money as I was going to be on my own. And so I actually took a job where the pay was $25 a month more than it was on the East Coast. And it was in a place called Baytown, Texas. And the Humble Oil Company. It really was a part of Exxon. Really changed my life. I saw the destruction of war. We made a trip to Berlin, which was, then divided into two pieces, the Russian side and the American side, and so on. Well, also the other two countries, Britain and the others who fought. Right? Anyway, and then you saw destruction, particularly when you went to Berlin. It was just flattened. I mean, you realize much of the country was that way. Now, out in the country with the farms and so on, it wasn't, but certainly in the cities, the bombing was tremendous. And of course, the Russians invaded Germany from the east, and the U.S. and the British and the Western forces, came in from the west. And then they divided Germany into two pieces, and then there was an eastern bloc and a western portion. And the western grew well, and the other was under the Russians and so on, and it didn't grow so well, but it was super communist and so on. So anyway, and we actually went to Berlin, and we could go over the border, sometimes with a little difficulty, go over the border and see how things were there. But anyway, the whole bit, and then to learn about the attempt at the extinction of the Jewish population of Europe, which was just unbelievably horrible. The prison camps and so on, which I didn't visit them at that time, but I did later on and so on. Just a horrible, horrible situation. And so when you realized the loss of the lives of the people who were killed, the shattered countries, the devastation and so on, I just said there's got to be for civilization something better than a war. And remember, we're just now celebrating the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, which was also, we were only in it for a few months, and there were more than 100,000 American casualties just from that. And so the deaths in that battle of the British, it really eliminated a whole generation of young British graduates, because they sent them into the trenches, and then they would get up and say, go on attack. And they were just mowed down by machine guns, but then they invented poison gas, and that burned people and so on. Anyway, it was, I said, the loss of lives, the devastation, and the suffering, and the misery, and all of this, there just has to be a better way of the world in the future. Because if we have another war, like World War II, which really engulfed the whole world. Remember, there was a war with Japan going on at the same time. Just think of the destruction. And now we have atomic weapons, so it's going to be devastating. So I really feel that I really felt that the big purpose of life was not whether I was good in the chemistry laboratory or not, but whether I could make some contribution to a better world. Now that sounds maybe sort of childish, but I really believed that, and so I began to think, I'm not going to get the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I was okay, I graduated and so on, I got my degree, but I just knew I wasn't going to be a Nobel Prize winner. I wasn't going to be a great chemist. And so I began to think about what I might do and other things and so on. So when I finished my degree, as I said before, I went to the Humble Oil Company and I was working there. But I also went to the University of Houston and I said, you must have German classes here in your night school. And he said, well, yes, but we're all full this year. We don't need anyone this year. And then the day before the semester started, he said, do you want to teach one or two courses? Because we suddenly had a surge of people who wanted to learn German. I said, well, I'll take two. So I did. And 2 nights a week, I would go into Houston, it's about 30 miles, 25 miles, and teach German, because I honestly believed that I had a better way of teaching language than the schools normally did. Now I learned fairly quickly that wasn't true. That in fact, languages are different in different people, and some learn them fast, rapidly, some are really interested, some think they should know it, but they are kind of bored by it and so on. So people are different. I didn't have 100% performance. But anyway, I learned something about teaching foreign languages, right? And it's not great. And I did that for a couple of years, and I gave a pretty hard course. But then came Sputnik, and I don't know, well, you all are too young to really remember what a shock it was for the United States to have the Russians put a man in space before us, right? You know, humiliation, retreat, you know, misery, and so on. So then the U.S. mobilized, and of course we have succeeded. But the Germans also, the Russians also have done very well in space. In fact, for the last, whatever it is, 2 or 3 years or more, we've had to use a Russian capsule to send our astronauts to the space station, because we don't have any longer a rocket that would do that. Now we're building another rocket for the future, but actually the cooperation with the Russians in space has been really quite remarkable, even when tensions are a bit strained, and you can actually see that now. Then something else happened. The U.S. Government had gotten permission. This would have never happened under Stalin, but things changed after Stalin died. And now the leader of the Soviet Union was Khrushchev. And Khrushchev really believed, I think, in his society, in his system, and believed it could stand up against America and hold its own. So he was willing to let Americans come to Russia. And they organized something called the, what's the name of it? Anyway, they decided to put on a great exhibition of American life. And what that consisted of, the U.S. Information Agency, which is now absorbed in the State Department, they just jumped at this opportunity to actually go in with live Americans into Russia, into Moscow, and for 40 days put on, in a very large area, a big fair. And it was kind of a display of all of the things that America had. And in a typical American house, they had a small house. Some people will remember the kitchen debate with Khrushchev Khrushchev and Nixon, who was vice president at the time. It was just amazing. And we would stand there as guides. There were 80 of us. And we would basically stand there for 10 hours a day and answer questions. We also had training how to deal with hecklers, because there were people who would say, "Why do you kill black people in America? What you all do is you have a horrible country," and so on. And we know that. Your people are dying on the streets and so on. Anyway, we kind of practiced, fending those off. And there were a lot of Russians who were terribly interested, really interested in what we had to say. So we learned a lot of Russian, and we got a lot of practice in speaking Russian. Once you've done that for 40 days, and actually before the thing started, before the affair started, we got there 15 days early, and we actually, I helped a gang of women pour cement, the cement floors for these buildings that we built. It was a huge event, worked on for more than a year, and it was absolutely sensational. And that really brought my Russian to a pretty good level. And when we went home, and my wife was there, well, I shouldn't forget this. We were married 5 days before the ship left for Europe. And she had to go back to school after we'd had the wedding. She had to go back and finish teaching for a week, or she wouldn't be paid for the month in Maryland. So anyway, she went back and taught, and I came to Washington. We were met by President Eisenhower, and all met with him, and then he went for a picture, and then we got on a train and we went to New York, and there we were all given the same kind of suit to wear. So we would always be easily identified as these 70 or 75, 80 of us were spread around this big acreage where the fair was. It was a tremendous experience. And actually 25 years later, Nixon had a renewal here. He had an assembly at the Smithsonian. And actually my company lent me a Learjet that would fly me up to Washington. I could stay for this event, and then they would fly me back so I would be present for I think the board meeting or some important meeting the next morning. So anyway, there was, and it was when Nixon appeared for that, it was just almost as if he were still president. He behaved in the same way. And the press was around him and asking questions and so on. It was just like 25 years before, and all of his problems and the humiliation and so on. But anyway, that's when the physics department of the University of Houston said, "Well, I know you can teach German, but can you teach Russian?" And I said, "Of course." I said, "Of course." I made the hardest Russian course that anyone ever had. I knew I only had 1 year probably for them, and I made it really tough, too tough. I started with, I think, 25 or 30, and I finished with 5, right? So the others all dropped in credit. But one of them went to Berkeley and did foreign languages. And unfortunately, during the riots in Berkeley, I lost track of it, and I'm still wondering what happened to my favorites. Interestingly, it wasn't very long before the State Department called and said that there is a delegation of scientists coming to the United States, and we wonder if you would be able to go with them and go with them and be the escort interpreter. There was another one as well, and the company was willing to give me leave again to go off and escort. And in fact, it was the reason they picked me for that was that the man who came was a very high political person in the Soviet government, but he also happened to be by profession an organic chemist. And he was actually giving a lecture on chemistry as we went to the University of Chicago, as we went to Berkeley, as we went to Caltech, and so on, around the country, and then came to Washington, where we actually met President Kennedy. And the reason was that, well, I mean, and the public would be invited to listen to the chemistry lecture which he gave, which was pretty modest, actually, chemistry. But anyway, I would interpret that. But then all the public who had been invited to hear his speech would go away. And a handful of professors who had taken on this issue of nuclear weapons, test ban treaty, do we have it, what should we do? And so that's what took place after the meeting. And it was a small group of professors who were advising the government on what they should do about this issue of test ban treaty and control of nuclear weapons. So then I found that after we'd been to Chicago and something happened when they went in the back room and so on, and I also went in the back room and I heard what they were discussing. And I realized, hey, this is really international negotiations at a very high level on a very important issue of whether we were going to bomb each other and destroy both countries. And so those discussions went on. We met briefly with President Kennedy at the National Academy of Sciences, where they were having their annual meeting and so on. And this was Professor Topchev was his name, and he was a member of the Politburo. And he had a chance to shake hands with President Kennedy because he was the president at the time, and he came over to the Academy of Sciences and made a brief speech. So we were present for all that, and that was a very exciting moment as well. So, and then there was another event where they asked me to be the interpreter. It was a visit of a Soviet oil delegation to the United States, and because Exxon was very concerned about the Russians moving into the world oil market, and so there had been an American delegation invited to Russia, and they had visited oil fields and seen the operations and so on. And this was the return visit of the Russians to the United States. So they called again and asked if I would be the interpreter for this group. And we went all around. We went to all kinds of oil fields. We went to an offshore thing, and we just did, we did a great deal. And I learned a lot about the oil business, which was quite appropriate because I was working for an oil company and so on. But anyway, I was in the lab working on inhibitors for polypropylene, which was the product that we were doing that the company was doing for the first time. But anyway, here was an opportunity and so on. But again, I was gone for, I think, 3 weeks on that trip as they traveled all around, and we were feted by CEOs of oil companies. We took taken to the hunting lodge of one of the managers of the oil company and showing his hunting range and so on. Anyway, that was a big deal, and also very interested, and the Russians were interested. So that was the next experience. And also I began to think more about, am I really a chemist, or should I be doing something else? Well, you have to eat, and so you have to keep working, and so I kept on working, and we did some things that were satisfactory for the company. But at an American Chemical Society meeting, they always have a big meeting once a year, and I would go to them as a working chemist. But I met the director of the International Office of the National Science Foundation, and he did paint a slightly exalted picture, excessively exalted picture of what his small office did. And I came away thinking, he seems to have the whole world in his pocket, so that wasn't quite the truth. It was a pretty small operation. But after a few months, I guess I was at the company for almost 5 years. But at the end of that time, I decided I wanted to do something else. And Dr. Rowe, Arthur Rowe, I still remember the name, which is surprising, offered me a job in his office, the international office of the National Science Foundation. And I took it. And I just happened to go at the time when President Kennedy's ambassador to Japan had persuaded the Japanese that they should have a cooperative science program together, right? And they needed a director for it. That is, there had been a lot of high-level people. There was a big advisory committee on both sides, and they all had big meetings, and the discussions would go on for months and a very long time and so on. But there was no one who was actually managing it on a day-to-day basis, and it went through the exchange of people, arranging that, and so on. So anyway, I became the director of that U.S.-Japan program. And let me tell you, that change made another major change in my life. I loved the job. It took me to Japan. I used to learn languages quickly. I can't do anything anymore, but anyway, I used to, and so I started doing Japanese. And in fact, and there was an office created, not by me, but by the people, to manage this program. On the U.S. side, they had a small office in Japan. And when I went there for the first time, I didn't want to tell them when I was arriving, so they wouldn't meet me, because I wanted to meet them myself and show how well I spoke Japanese from my miserable little lessons. And we ended up at the wrong hotel, because the two hotels, they were actually Japanese inns, but anyway, the two of them had the same name, and the taxi driver took me to the wrong one. But anyway, it all worked out, and so I did that for 2 years, and it was a tremendous experience. I did learn some Japanese. It wasn't too fantastic, but anyway, I did, and we actually found some people would joke, say, well, the Japanese don't have any equipment, they hardly have labs anymore, and so on, everything was destroyed, and they aren't very good anyway, because they haven't worked for 10 years on real stuff. But they were good, and we found projects which could be worked on. And that program went on for a very long time. After 2 years, I guess I had a 2-year appointment at the National Science Foundation. I think I could have stayed there, but I had a big meeting with the vice president of the company, of the foundation. And he says, you know, I'm 58 years old. He says, I don't have so many moves left in me. But he says, you have a lot. And so what else might you be doing? Well, I said, the State Department has said to me they would like me to come and work as a number 2 science officer in the embassy in Germany. And he said, well, you always want to keep learning in what you do when you're young. And I said, you know, you have made the decision for me right now. I can run that Japan program. I've done all kinds of things about it, but I know it. I can probably do a better job in the future, but I won't learn, I myself won't learn new things, because it will be the same thing going on. So you made the decision for me. I'm going to the State Department, and I'm going to be a diplomat for the first. And that was a very good job. They actually had 2 people doing science in an embassy, which was pretty unusual, but it was very good. The Germans began a space program at that time, a modest one, but so there was a lot of activity for a science office in the country. But a man named John Gronowski, good Polish name, who was Postmaster General, and he went over to see Lyndon Johnson one day, who was president at the time, Johnson says, I'm sending you to Poland. You got a Polish name? And then he, well, I don't speak Polish. Well, that's all right. You don't have to speak Polish. Speak English, right? But you're going to be my ambassador to Poland. And you're kind of going to be my super ambassador for Eastern Europe. Now you can imagine what that did in the spirit, to the spirit of the 4 or 5 ambassadors who had all the countries that were in Eastern Europe, by saying you're kind of the super ambassador for the region. So that was a terrible mistake, and people were mad at him. But he loved meeting with people, and he did go around and meet a lot of people in Poland, but he also with us, he liked to talk with us. He just was a man who would just sit there. It was a classic sort of sitting together, smoking cigarettes and talking about life and diplomacy and Poland and so on and so on. So, but it wasn't exactly a rigorous State Department diplomacy and management, and so that was a bit of an issue with the other people in the region, because he and a person at the State Department were always trying to push things like make Germany and Poland come together again. Well, the professionals knew this wasn't quite the time for it. But anyway, we did go and spent 2.5 years in Warsaw, and in those 2 years, we had 2 small children while we were in Germany. That is, they were born in the U.S. and they came with us, but they were very young, 2 and under. And then we had 2 more children while we were in Poland, and my wife, to deliver the children, they didn't want us to go to a Polish hospital. They thought she might be doped and then would reveal secrets. Anyway, it was a policy, so she had to be flown out to an Air Force hospital in Wiesbaden, Germany. And so she went out twice and brought back 2 children. So when we left after 2.5 years in Poland, we came back with 4 kids under 5 years and under. And it was really, and since she had had 5 people helping her in the house in Poland for less than $100 a month, in the US it was a little bit different. So Georgine, my wife's name, Georgine had a pretty tough time, but anyway, I loved the job. I really liked the job in Poland. It was terribly interesting, and we did a lot of things which I also could talk about, but won't anymore. But won't anymore today. But it was a great opportunity, and now the Office of Science and Technology was really a small body of expert scientists who would carry on issues and analyze issues basically for the president. And there were only about 35 people and so on, but I was the international person. And some very exciting things internationally happened in that period. It was when President Nixon and Henry Kissinger decided that there should be a new relationship between the U.S. and China. And it so happened that they were interested in having some suggestions for what might be cooperation in science with China. And so I was given the assignment, and this was about 2 weeks before they were leaving. You can't tell anyone, and don't work with anyone else, but we need some suggestions for projects to show what we might do. Well, obviously I did talk to some people who would also keep it secret at the Academy of Sciences, who had been studying possible projects with China for several years, but had never had anything turned into it. But anyway, we managed to put together, I think, 40 projects. Kissinger you would give something to Kissinger at night, he would send it back the next morning and say, no good. And that happened, I think, 3 times, but finally it was good. And that, as far as I know, went to Beijing. And then when the communique from their visit came out, one of the things which was written was, there will be also a cooperative area in science. Big success. I mean, this was the kind of thing. And this, we didn't call it science diplomacy then, but think about it. That was classic science diplomacy, clearly for the purpose of building a relationship between the U.S. and China, which had not existed for 25 years. Actually, in Poland, the embassy in Poland had been designated as the one American post which could speak to the Chinese. And so every 6 months or something, there would be a small meeting and some little issues would be discussed, but that was the only communications point. And ironically, I was located for 2 years in that area. So I didn't attend those meetings. There was another person who spoke Chinese in the embassy who did that. But anyway, that was a story. But this was a very, very big deal. They had also wondered, because the Vietnam War was going on, and they also wondered what would be happening there, and what would the Russians do, because they were feeding equipment and supplies and supporting the Vietnamese, but still, and so there was silence they sent a proposal to the Russians and so on, and there was silence for a week. And then came the message back, your suggested date for the meeting in Moscow is set, it will go ahead. In essence, what happened is that the Russians accepted the proposal of the US, and so then we started planning the trip to Moscow to actually sign an agreement. Well, I had the idea that we should work with the Russians anyway, and I had started through the system, through the approval system in the U.S. government, the idea of a sort of scientific cooperation program with the U.S. and Russia. And so we were ready with an idea of what might happen. And so there was some fussing about it and some meetings about it, but actually they did go, we did finally go to Moscow, and we took our ideas, and they were modified and accepted by the Russians. And that began 9 years of really quite close cooperative activity. Now, what happened to us? We had gone down, it was I think sometime in December or late November. Anyway, sometime in the fall of that year was the last launch of the Apollo. They were going to have 20 of them, but they stopped at 17. And we all went down to the launch pad. We all went down to the facility, and we watched the launch of Apollo 17, which is really the last one. And but we also knew that there was some discussion about our office and what would be the future role of our office. And Nixon was president, and there was silence, and we knew that there would be a meeting talking about what was in the future for the science office. And so we waited when we came back from the launch, we waited for the president or at least for our boss to find out what was going to happen to the office. And surprisingly, the word came that the office is eliminated. My boss called it'd been about a week or so, 8 days or so, after we'd come back from the launch. And it was suddenly called a staff meeting. Staff meeting lasted 5 minutes. The message that was delivered is the office has been eliminated. It will still exist on paper until July 1st of next year, which was then, what, 6 months, 7 months from the date. I am leaving today, said my boss. He was the head of the office. I am leaving today. You will read in the newspaper what my job will be, where I'm working tomorrow. I know you will hold the flag high. Goodbye. Well, let me tell you, if an office, if your office is eliminated in the U.S. government, your phone doesn't ring very often, I'll tell you that. And so we knew it was over. And it was. They eliminated the office. Well, what were they doing about science? Well, the National Science Foundation can do all that. And so they did transfer the authority from our office, which disappeared, to the National Science Foundation. And they carried it on, and then under the next administration, it was recreated. But this time it was recreated with congressional approval and legally created by the Congress, and so it couldn't be eliminated just by a president again. At least that's the reality. But so then the big question was, what do I do? Because I have no job. Well, there was someone in the government who knew about a company called Texas Instruments, and they decided that what had happened is that Nixon and well, it was Khrushchev on the other side, but it was at a time when things were changing with Russia, and Texas Instruments, which also made some military equipment and so on, had always been very patriotic and very pro-American oriented and sort of anti-Russian. But the head man, the board chair, wrote a little email which said maybe it's time to change our policy. And so I was essentially given the responsibility to take a look at the Eastern Bloc and Russia and so on. Well, in a business sense, it wasn't. Anyway, they hired me. That was the point, because they said, well, he knows something about government. He can, and our chairman was doing things with government-oriented activities, and so there was some things for me to do in that area, particularly if it was a policy issue and he was working with another group, not in semiconductors, which is what the company made, but in military equipment, but in other things like what should the policy be toward this one and that one. So anyway, that's what I started doing, and in general, it was pretty much of a failure. With the Russians, it really didn't work. TI, Texas Instruments, was not a company which easily would tolerate the Russians or accept their demands and so on. But we tried for a little bit and so on. We did sell one piece of equipment to Poland. It was a system for guiding the landings of aircraft and so on. It was part of the stuff you need in an airport, and you had to get approvals and so on from the government and so on. But they approved it, and it did go. So that was one thing we sold. And so when my 3-year term was up, it was a 3-year call, and when it was over, the person who had been working close with me took over. He was made the science advisor to the secretary, and he did his 3 years in that role, and that continued to be filled for 5, and it's stalled here under the present administration, and we hope that it will be bad. Not all the people have been eliminated, but there is no person given the title of science advisor to the Secretary of State, which is very important because your ability, even you don't see the secretaries so often because they've got lots of things to worry about. But to know that you're operating under the name, the protection, if you like, and with access to the Secretary of State is very important in a building like that, in a big organization like that. So it was, and I think it was doing well. The person who was doing it had done it for 2 years, decided that under the present administration it wasn't going to go anywhere, so he resigned. And people who were on the staff are those who are supporting it now. And I don't know how many even there are, but there are some. I think eventually it will be restored as the position, but maybe not under this administration. We shall see. I then went to AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, at the request of the director, Alan Leshner. And Alan Leshner, a very distinguished gentleman, he had run two of the units in NIH, a very distinguished and professional scientist, and one who also was tremendous at picking people and then inspiring them with his enthusiastic participation. And he just retired, I guess it's 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And there has been a replacement, someone who had been in the Congress and for 18 years and was a physicist to begin with. But there are some issues which have developed with AAAS, and I think they're still working. I am still with the organization on a non-salary basis, and I'm focusing now on science diplomacy with one real focus, and that's North Korea. Now, you people are going to hear a lot about science diplomacy from your professor there. And he's a remarkable man. As you know, he's from Iran, a remarkable man who's here and who's really gotten deeply into this issue of science diplomacy and turning it into an action activity at the university. I commend him highly. It's the perfect thing to do, to show that there is a governmental dimension, a foreign policy dimension to all the things we do with other countries, such as those that he will be doing science with. So it's a very exciting time. I'm so glad that some of you have endured all the space of this. I mean, even if you haven't, look at the last page or listen to the last sentence, which is science diplomacy. And you can argue whether it's diplomatic, you can argue whether it's really science and so on, but I'm telling you, it's important, it has meaning, it has significance, and we have to build linkages like this if we're going to save this glorious world. So thanks so much.